The wind in Redemption Gulch had a personality, and it was a mean one. It came off the high desert plains, with nothing to slow it, carrying dust that tasted of alkali and ancient disappointments. It scoured the paint from the false-fronted buildings and worked its way through the chinks in every wall, a constant whining reminder of the unforgiving nature of the land. On this particular afternoon it whipped a woman's dark hair across her face, but she did not move to brush it away. She stood alone in the centre of the dusty thoroughfare, a splash of deep blue silk in a world of brown and grey. The dress was fine, intricately embroidered with birds Abel could not name, but it was hopelessly out of place, its hem already stained with the grime of the street. Her feet were bare. She was as still as a doe that has heard the snap of a twig, frozen not by indecision, but by the complete absence of any path forward. The town watched. Men paused on the boardwalks, leaning against support posts, with the casual cruelty of spectators at a dogfight. Women peered from behind the safety of shop windows, their faces tight with a mixture of pity and contempt. They had all seen it. Silas Croft, whose mining interests fed the town and whose word was as good as law, had brought her here. She was to be a bride for one of his foremen, a man with a face like a clenched fist and eyes that held no light. The foreman had taken one look at her foreign face and silent, unmoving dignity, and refused. He had laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I wanted a wife, Croft, not a porcelain doll that don't speak." Croft, a man whose polished boots and tailored coat could not hide the avarice in his soul, had not taken the public refusal well. His investment had soured, in a gesture of theatrical magnanimity that was really just a public washing of his hands. He had declared her free of any contract, but also free of any claim to his protection or provision. He left her standing there, a piece of rejected cargo, while he retreated into the warmth and whiskey of the Grand Hotel. Now the station master was gesturing to the tracks. The next train, the eastbound freight, was not due for hours, but his meaning was clear. She was not a resident, she was a problem. And problems in Redemption Gulch were encouraged to move on one way or another. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on some point far beyond the town, beyond the saw-toothed mountains that clawed at the horizon. Abel watched from the shade of the general store's awning. He had been in town for salt, flour, and cartridges, a biannual trip he made with grim efficiency. He had no love for the town or the people in it. His world was the high basin, a lonely spread of land cradled by aspen and pine, where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the lowing of his few cattle. He had come down from the mountain seeking supplies, not complications. He had seen her arrive on the noon stage, a small, silent figure dwarfed by Croft and his swaggering foreman. He had felt a familiar cold knot tighten in his gut. It was the same knot he felt whenever he saw a hawk circling a rabbit, the same feeling of a grim, preordained unfairness. He had turned away then, busying himself with his list, not wanting to witness what he knew was coming. But the town was small and its cruelties were loud. He watched now as the station master grew impatient, taking a step toward her. The woman, May as Croft had called her, did not flinch. There was a strength in her stillness that shamed the fidgeting impatience of the men around her. It was the resilience of a river stone, worn smooth by a current that would have shattered a lesser thing. Abel thought of his late wife, Sarah. She had possessed a different kind of strength, a warmth that had filled his cabin and his life, a light extinguished too soon by a fever that had respected no boundaries. The memory was a dull ache, a phantom limb that throbbed in the cold. The station master put a hand on the woman's arm. It was not a rough touch, but it was insistent. At the contact her stillness broke. She looked at the hand on her silk sleeve, then up at the man's face. Her own expression did not change, but a tremor ran through her. It was the only sign of the terror that must have been flooding her veins. Something in Abel broke loose. It was not a conscious decision. It was an instinct, like throwing a hand up to ward off a blow. He pushed himself off the wall he was leaning against. The crunch of his worn boots on the dusty boardwalk was unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. The crowd, sensing a new development in the day's dreary entertainment, turned to watch him. Abel was not a large man, but he was solid, carved from the same hard material as the mountains he called home. His face was weathered, a landscape of quiet grief and solitude, and his eyes, the colour of a winter sky, missed nothing. He walked past the onlookers without seeing them, his focus entirely on the woman and the man trying to move her. He stopped a few feet away. He did not address the station master. He looked at the woman. Her eyes, dark and deep, met his. He saw fear in them, yes, but beneath it, something else. A flicker of defiance, a refusal to be broken. "I need a cook," Abel said. The words came out rough, like stones grinding together, unused to forming sentences for anyone but his horse. The station master let go of her arm, turning to Abel with relief. "She's no concern of yours, Abel. Croft's business." "Looks to me like Croft's business is concluded," Abel stated, his gaze still on the woman. He held her eyes, trying to convey a meaning his words could not. "I am not like them." He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the worn leather of his coin purse. He had sold 3 good beaver pelts that morning. After the flour, salt, and other necessities, he had exactly $10 left. It was meant to see him through until the spring thaw, a buffer against disaster. He looked from her to the station master, then at the saloon, where he knew Croft was holding court. He could feel the weight of the town's judgment, the curiosity, the scorn. Let them watch. He took out the 2 $5 gold pieces. They shone with a dull gleam in his palm. He held them out, not to the station master, but toward the general direction of the Grand Hotel. "For her contract," he said, the words a challenge. "Whatever is owed." A murmur went through the crowd. This was not a rescue, this was a transaction. It was something they could understand. The station master, eager to be rid of the situation, scurried toward the hotel to inform Croft of the offer. Abel did not wait for an answer. He knew Croft's greed. The man would take the money. It was an admission of his own failure that he could spin into a profit. Abel turned his attention back to the woman. She had watched the entire exchange, her head held high. The high, stiff collar of her dress framed a face that was pale but composed. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the wagon, where his supplies were loaded, and his horse stood waiting patiently. An invitation, an offer of passage. She looked at his outstretched hand, empty now except for the lines of hard work etched into the skin. She looked at his eyes, searching for the cruelty she had seen in every other man that day. She found none. What she found was a vast, quiet emptiness, like a winter landscape, but one that was not hostile. It was just there. After a long moment, a silence that stretched and pulled at the air, she gave a single, slow nod. Without another word, Abel turned and walked back to his wagon. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would be. He heard the soft, shuffling sound of her bare feet in the dust behind him. The whispers of the townspeople followed them like a swarm of biting flies, but Abel ignored them. He untied his horse, climbed onto the wagon seat, and picked up the reins. A moment later, she was there, standing by the wheel. He reached down and offered a hand. She hesitated for only a second before placing her small, cold hand in his. He pulled her up onto the seat beside him. Her fine silk dress was a stark contrast to his worn canvas jacket. They sat a foot apart, 2 solitary figures on the rough wooden bench, a universe of silence between them. He clucked to the horse, and the wagon lurched forward, pulling them away from the gawking faces of Redemption Gulch, away from the dust and the cruelty, and toward the looming, indifferent mountains. The journey to his homestead was a long one, climbing out of the barren basin and into the foothills. The air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of pine and damp earth. They did not speak. Abel had never been a man for idle chatter, and she, he was beginning to realize, might not be able to speak at all. She sat rigidly, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed forward. The silence was not uncomfortable for Abel, it was his natural state. But this was a shared silence, and that was new. His cabin was nestled in a small valley, a solid structure of hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. A plume of smoke from his morning fire still drifted from the stone chimney, a lonely signal in the vast wilderness. It was a place built for one, for solitude and survival, not for company. Inside it was Spartan and functional. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a narrow cot was pushed against another. A rough-hewn table and a single chair sat in the centre. The shelves held tins and jars, and a rack near the door held his rifle. It was clean, but it lacked any touch of comfort. It was a shelter, not a home. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. "We're here," he said, the words feeling foolishly obvious. He turned to help her down, but she was already moving, sliding from the seat, with a quiet grace, her bare feet landing softly on the hard-packed earth. She stood for a moment, taking in the cabin, the towering pines, the immense silent bowl of the sky. Her face was unreadable. Abel began to unhitch the horse, his movements economical and practiced. He expected her to wait, to stand uncertainly as she had in town. Instead, when he turned back from leading the horse to the lean-to that served as a barn, she was already at the back of the wagon, carefully lifting a sack of flour. It was heavy, nearly half her weight, but she managed it, her arms straining, her jaw set with determination. "Here," he said, his voice gruff as he took the sack from her. "I'll get it." She stepped back and gave a small, formal bow of her head. It was a gesture of thanks, but also of deference. He carried the supplies inside, piling them on the table. When he came back out, she was gathering an armful of fallen branches and pine cones for kindling. She did not wait to be told. She saw what needed to be done, and did it. That first evening set the rhythm for the days that followed. A silent partnership bloomed in the small cabin. While Abel tended to his cattle, checked his trap lines, and chopped wood, she transformed the interior of the cabin. She found his meager collection of cleaning supplies and set to work. She scrubbed the floor until the wood gleamed, washed the single window until the afternoon light poured in, and organized his shelves with a meticulous precision. She cooked, using the flour he had bought and the dried beans and salted pork from his stores. She created meals that were simple but deeply nourishing. The scent of baking bread, a smell he had not known in his home for 3 years, filled the cabin. He would return from the cold, weary and grim, to find a bowl of hot stew waiting on the table and a small loaf of bread beside it. She would be sitting quietly by the fire, mending one of his shirts with tiny perfect stitches. They communicated in gestures. A nod from him toward the water bucket was all it took. A questioning look from her while holding a potato was answered by a nod. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression, the slight downturn of her lips that meant weariness, the faint light in her eyes when she tasted a wild berry he brought her. He learned her name was May, not from her speaking it, but from the intricate characters she once drew in the frost on the window pane, pointing to herself. One evening he returned to find she had used a piece of discarded burlap and some thread unravelled from a sack to create a small, crude mat for the floor by the hearth. It was a small thing, but it was an act of creation, of making a home where there had only been a shelter. He looked at it, then at her. She was watching him, her dark eyes searching his face for a reaction. He gave a single, slow nod of approval. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips before vanishing. He bought her boots. On a trip to a trapper's outpost 10 miles further up the mountain, he traded a prime wolf pelt for a pair of sturdy leather work boots. He estimated her size by memory. When he returned, he left the box on the floor by the door without a word and went outside to split wood. When he came back in for supper, the box was gone and she was wearing them. They were a little big, but she had stuffed the toes with scraps of cloth. She no longer had to walk barefoot on the cold ground. Through it all, she never removed the high-collared blue dress. She washed it at night when he was asleep, hanging it by the fire to dry, wearing one of his oversized shirts as a nightgown. By morning she would be dressed in it again, the stiff collar buttoned to her chin. It seemed a part of her, a piece of armor she could not or would not discard. Abel wondered about it, about the life she had lived before Redemption Gulch, but he did not ask. Her silence was a wall he did not know how to breach, and he respected its boundaries. He had walls of his own. Winter arrived not as a gentle dusting, but as an assault. The sky turned the color of lead, and a wind that carried the chill of the grave howled down from the peaks. The snow began to fall thick and heavy, burying the world in a blanket of white. For 3 days it did not stop. The cabin became an island in a sea of snow, the windows showing nothing but a swirling vortex of white. Abel worked tirelessly to secure his small herd in the lean-to, rationing their meager supply of hay. The cold was a physical thing, a predator that sought any crack, any moment of weakness. On the 3rd day, while fighting his way back from the lean-to through waist-deep drifts, a gust of wind caught him off balance. He fell, his leg twisting under him at a bad angle. A sharp, searing pain shot up from his ankle. He managed to crawl the last 20 yards to the cabin, collapsing through the door in a shower of snow, his face pale and beaded with sweat. May was there in an instant. Her eyes widened in alarm as she saw his condition. She helped him drag himself to the cot, her small frame surprisingly strong. Without a word, she knelt and carefully cut away his boot and pant leg with his own skinning knife. The ankle was already swelling, turning a dark, ugly purple. For the next week the world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The blizzard raged outside, sealing them in. Abel, feverish from the pain and a developing chill in his lungs, was helpless. He who had always been the provider, the rock of self-sufficiency, was now completely dependent on the silent woman he had taken in. May became his caretaker. She kept the fire roaring, melting snow for water. She tore strips from one of the flour sacks to bind his ankle, creating a tight, effective splint with pieces of kindling. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark he had stored, a remedy for fever he had learned from a Ute man long ago. She coaxed the foul-tasting liquid past his lips. She bathed his face with a cool cloth. In his fevered state, the walls of his own solitude began to crack. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and in the hazy twilight between he spoke. He spoke of Sarah. He told the silent, watching woman about her laughter, about the way she had planted wild roses by the cabin door, roses that had long since withered. He spoke of the child they had been waiting for, a life that had flickered out along with its mother's. The words poured out of him, a torrent of grief he had held back for 3 years. May listened. She sat by his cot, her hands busy with mending or preparing broth, but her attention was entirely on him. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the language of loss. She had heard it in her own heart. One night, as he shivered violently with a chill, she did something that startled him, even through his delirium. She lay down on the floor beside his cot and reached through the slats, placing her small warm hand on his forehead. The gesture was not one of passion, but of profound elemental comfort, a tether to the living world. As the fever broke and his mind cleared, he grew quiet again, embarrassed by his own vulnerability. But something had changed between them. The space was no longer filled with the silence of strangers, but with the quiet of shared understanding. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, her grace and resilience a constant, quiet miracle. He noticed the way the firelight caught the threads of the birds on her dress, the way she would sometimes pause and look out the snow-choked window, her expression distant and sorrowful. One afternoon, as she was rebandaging his ankle, his hand brushed against the high, stiff collar of her dress. It felt unnaturally rigid, not just from starch, but as if there was something flat and hard sewn within the layers of fabric. She pulled back slightly at his touch, a flicker of alarm in her eyes. He did not press the matter, but the question lodged in his mind. What was she protecting? What secret did she carry so close? A secret she guarded as fiercely as he guarded his own grief. The blizzard had been a crucible, forcing them together, but he knew another test was coming. The snow could not last forever, and the world he had shut out would eventually find its way to his door. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. The world dripped, the snow receded, leaving the ground sodden and brown, hungry for the spring sun. Abel's ankle healed, leaving him with a slight limp he knew would be a permanent companion. The rhythm of their life returned. But it was a different rhythm now. The quiet was deeper, more comfortable. He found himself looking for her when he came in, his eyes seeking her out by the fire. The cabin felt empty when she was outside for even a moment. One morning as he was splitting wood, he saw them. 2 riders picking their way up the muddy track that served as a road to his valley. One was the town sheriff, a man named Cowboy, whose spine was as flexible as his income required. The other was Silas Croft. Abel rested his axe and watched them approach, a cold, hard knot forming in his stomach. He had known this was coming. Croft was not a man to let a perceived slight go unanswered. He was a creature of ownership and control, and Abel had taken something from him. May had seen them, too. She stood in the cabin doorway, a silhouette against the firelight, her posture rigid. Abel walked to stand in front of the door, placing himself between her and the approaching men. He was not armed, but his presence was a clear barrier. Croft reined in his horse, a magnificent black stallion that was as polished and arrogant as its owner. He surveyed the small homestead with a dismissive sneer. "Abel, I see you've survived the winter." "I usually do," Abel replied, his voice flat. "I've come on a matter of business," Croft said, ignoring Abel's tone. He gestured with his riding crop toward the cabin. "You have something that belongs to me." "I paid $10 for her contract," Abel stated. "The transaction is complete." Croft laughed, a humorless, condescending sound. $10? A pittance. A temporary lease, perhaps. But her indenture, the cost of her passage and procurement, is 100 times that. She is a debt, Abel. A piece of property that has not been fully paid for. He was lying, Abel knew. He had publicly disavowed her. This was about something else. "She's a person," Abel said, the words low and dangerous. "She is an asset," Croft countered, his voice turning sharp. "And now she is a complication." "But," he continued, a smug smile spreading across his face, "I am a reasonable man. I don't even want her back. The asset is clearly defective. What I want is this valley." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Abel, Mr. Croft has filed a claim. Says your northern boundary marker is improperly placed, that your water rights are drawing from his upstream source." It was a lie, and they all knew it. Abel's claim was old and solid, filed by his father. But Croft had money and influence. He could tie Abel up in legal battles for years, bleeding him dry until he had no choice but to sell. "So this is your offer," Abel said, looking directly at Croft. "Her for my land." "Not exactly," Croft said smoothly. "The land is already mine, by right of a more accurate survey. I'm simply giving you a choice. You can sign over the deed, vacate the premises peacefully, and take the woman with you. I won't pursue the matter of her debt, or you can fight my claim. I will win, of course. And when I do, the sheriff here will have no choice but to evict you, at which point I will also take possession of my property to settle her accounts." He nodded toward May. "She'll be sent to work in the laundry at the mining camp. They are always in need of women there." The threat hung in the air, vile and potent. Abel felt a surge of rage so pure and hot it nearly blinded him. He looked at May. She had not moved, but he could feel her terror reaching him across the few feet that separated them. She understood the threat, if not the words. She knew what a woman alone and unprotected would face in a mining camp. Abel's world narrowed to a single point of focus. This cabin, this land, this woman, they were his. Not by law, not by purchase, but by the shared crucible of winter and the quiet, undeniable bond that had formed between them. He had been a man of solitude, a man who had lost everything and walled himself off from the world. But this woman, This silent, resilient survivor had slipped through the cracks in his fortress. She had brought life back into the dead spaces of his home and his heart. To give her up now would be a second, deeper death. He took a step forward, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. He looked Silas Croft dead in the eye. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it had the finality of a rock slide. "The land is mine, and she is not your property." Croft's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "You are making a mistake, homesteader. Sheriff, you are witness to his refusal." "I am," Calloway said, his voice weak. "Then we will proceed as planned," Croft declared. He dismounted, pulling a rolled document from his saddlebag. Two more men, hired thugs by the look of them, emerged from the tree line behind him, rifles held loosely but ready. "I have an eviction notice signed by the judge himself. You have 1 hour to gather your personal effects." The confrontation had arrived. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the promise of violence. Abel stood his ground, a lone man against the weight of Croft's power and corrupted law. He glanced back at May, who remained framed in the doorway, a silent statue of defiance. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not fear but a resolute trust. That trust was a shield and a sword. "This is my home," Abel said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He was not talking to Croft anymore. He was making a statement to the sky, to the mountains, to whatever force governed the affairs of men. "And she is under my protection." Croft sneered, unrolling the document. "Your protection means nothing. The law is the law. This woman has no standing, no name, no voice. She is a ghost. I own her." He took a step forward, his men fanning out behind him. "Now stand aside." Abel did not move. He was calculating the odds. 2 armed men and Croft. He had an axe nearby, his rifle was inside, but they would be on him before he could reach either. It was a losing fight. But retreat was not an option. "She has a name," Abel said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. He was stalling for time, for an idea, for a miracle. "And she is not a ghost." He took a half-step back, closer to the doorway, closer to May. He looked at her and then back at Croft, a desperate, wild plan forming in his mind, a lie that might save them. "She is my wife." The words hung in the cold spring air, stunning everyone into silence. The sheriff's jaw dropped. Croft's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in suspicion. Even May, who could not understand the word, understood the shift in the dynamic, the raw declaration in Abel's tone. "Your wife?" Croft finally spat, a disbelieving laugh catching in his throat. "You married this mute? When? There's no record, no preacher, no magistrate." "We don't need a preacher for it to be true," Abel said, his voice steady. He was building the lie, brick by brick. "This is our home. She belongs here, with me." It was a desperate gamble, a claim of common law marriage that might not hold up, but it was all he had. Croft's face hardened into a mask of rage. The pretense of legality was falling away, revealing the brute force beneath. "Lies won't save you. I'm taking what is mine." He gestured to his men. "Get her." One of the thugs started forward, a cruel grin on his face. Abel moved to intercept him, his body tensing for the impact, but before he could, May stepped out from the doorway. She moved with a sudden, shocking speed, placing herself not behind Abel but beside him. She held up a hand, a gesture to stop, then she spoke. The sound was a dry, rasping whisper, the first sound he had ever heard her make. It was a single word in a language he did not know. "Jushu." "Jushu. Stop." The thug hesitated, surprised. Croft, however, was enraged by her defiance. "Grab her!" he roared. The man lunged, not for Abel, but for May. He grabbed the front of her fine silk dress, his fist closing on the high, stiff collar. The fabric, old and worn, ripped with a harsh, tearing sound. As he yanked her forward, something small and flat, wrapped in oilskin, fell from the shredded lining of her collar and landed in the mud at her feet. Everything stopped. All eyes went to the small packet. In the sudden, tense silence, May bent down, her movements fluid and graceful despite the chaos. She picked up the oilskin bundle. Her hands, trembling slightly, unwrapped it. Inside was a folded document, its paper yellowed and creased. She did not look at Abel, she looked directly at Silas Croft, and her eyes, once filled with fear, now blazed with a cold, righteous fire. She took a step toward the sheriff and held out the paper. Calloway, looking bewildered, took it from her. He unfolded it carefully. His eyes scanned the top, then widened. He looked from the paper to Croft, then back to the paper. "What in God's name is this?" he breathed. "It's a forgery," Croft snapped, but a line of sweat had appeared on his brow. "It doesn't look like a forgery," the sheriff said, his voice gaining a sliver of authority for the first time. "It's a land grant from the Central Pacific Railroad Company, signed and sealed." He looked at May. "It's for a 160-acre parcel, prime timber and water rights." He paused, then read the name inscribed on the deed. "It's granted to one Mei-Ling Zhou." He looked up, a dawning comprehension on his face. "But this parcel, this is Croft's northern logging camp. This is the land you just filed a new survey for." The truth fell into place with the force of an avalanche. Croft hadn't just brought May over as a bride. He had brought her over to control her, and through her, to control the land that was rightfully hers. Her father, a railroad foreman, had been granted the land for his service. Croft had likely orchestrated his death and lured his only heir across the ocean with false promises of help, planning to seize her inheritance through a sham marriage. When his foreman refused her, the plan had unraveled and he had simply discarded her, assuming the mute, terrified girl was helpless, her secret document forever hidden. "This is preposterous," Croft blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "The girl is a mute immigrant. The paper is meaningless." "It's written in English and Chinese," the sheriff said, turning the paper over. "And it's got the seal of the United States Land Office right here. This is as legal as it gets." He looked at Croft, and for the first time he saw him not as a source of income, but as a criminal. "Silas, you've been logging on her property. You filed a fraudulent claim against Abel to try and push him out because his land borders it. This is grand larceny." Croft's face went pale. His empire was built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, and the key brick had just been pulled loose. He looked at May, at the woman he had dismissed as a piece of defective property, and saw his ruin. With a strangled cry of rage he lunged, not at May, but at the document in the sheriff's hand. It was a foolish, desperate move. Abel, anticipating it, stepped forward and drove his fist into Croft's stomach. The man doubled over, the air rushing out of him in a pained gasp. His two thugs, seeing their employer defeated, and the law suddenly turning against them, exchanged a look and began to back away toward the trees, wanting no part of the fallout. Sheriff Calloway looked down at the wheezing form of Silas Croft, then at Abel, and finally at May, who stood tall and straight, her torn dress a testament to the battle she had just won. The sheriff pocketed the deed. "I believe," he said, his voice firm, "that Mr. Croft and I need to take a ride back to town and have a long talk with the circuit judge." The aftermath was quiet. The sheriff hauled a protesting Silas Croft onto his horse and led him away, leaving his stallion behind. The silence that descended on the valley was profound, broken only by the sound of the wind and the dripping of melting snow. Abel turned to May. He looked at her torn dress, at the faint red marks on her neck where the thug had grabbed her. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching the ruined collar, his touch infinitely tender. She did not pull away. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding a universe of gratitude, pain, and a dawning hope. He saw the tracks of silent tears on her cheeks. "My wife," he said, the words no longer a lie but a question, a hope, a promise. She did not speak, she did not need to. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest for just a moment. It was an answer more eloquent than any word. It was the end of one life, and the beginning of another. In the weeks that followed, the world changed. News of Silas Croft's downfall spread through Redemption Gulch like a grass fire. His empire, built on fraudulent claims and intimidation, crumbled. The sheriff, emboldened by his one act of genuine justice, found other discrepancies, other victims. Croft was gone, his power broken by a silent woman and a piece of paper she had carried across the world. Life in the High Valley returned to its rhythm, but the melody had changed. It was no longer a solo. The quiet between Abel and May was now filled with a deep and abiding comfort. He learned the story of her past, not through words, but through the shared language of survival. He understood the trauma that had stolen her voice, the sight of her father's death in a staged railroad accident. He understood that the deed she carried was not just a claim to land, but the last piece of her family, a legacy she had protected at all costs. She in turn learned the shape of his grief. She saw the way his eyes would linger on the spot where the wild roses had been, the way he would sometimes hold the small, worn whittling of a bird that Sarah had kept on the mantel. She did not try to fill the void Sarah had left, but she gently, patiently, began to build something new beside it. She planted a garden, using seeds he bought for her from the store in town, a place where he was now greeted with a grudging respect. She tilled a small patch of earth near the cabin. She planted vegetables for their table, but she also planted a small cutting of a hardy mountain rose she found growing near the creek. One evening, as the sun bled across the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they stood together by the cabin door. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new life. Abel's limp was less pronounced, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment. May wore a new dress, a simple one of blue cotton he had bought her, but she had sewn a new collar for it herself, plain and unadorned. There were no more secrets to hide. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her dark hair. The $10 he had spent in the dust of Redemption Gulch felt like the best investment a man had ever made. It had bought him more than a cook, more than a companion. It had bought him a future he had thought was lost to him forever. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were small and strong, and they curled around his without hesitation. They stood there for a long time, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. Two solitary figures who had found a shared world in the heart of the wilderness. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that mattered. His house was a home. His life was no longer a memory of what was lost, but a quiet, hopeful testament to what had been found.